Hey, what's up? I'm Channel Pup Fanboy Supervillain, and it is the 1-year anniversary of Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon, the free encore DLC to Sonic Frontiers that gave the game a brand new ending, which it dearly needed. I did review this back when it came out, however, since that time there have been a couple of patches that have made some fairly substantial changes to this DLC. And on top of that, my opinions have had a bit more time to kind of cement themselves as well over the past year. So I figured, let's revisit Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon. Subscribe if you haven't already, and if you want to become my boss and support me further, the link to my Patreon page is in the description below. Thank you very much. So, Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon was extremely polarizing. While on paper this DLC sounded like a dream come true with other playable characters and a new final boss, rather than being the culmination of everything the Frontiers development team had learned throughout the game's rocky production, we instead got more experimentation. And this one was particularly ambitious with how far it was pushing the framework the base Frontiers had already laid down. And there were a lot of ideas that were implemented in ways that just didn't feel cohesive with the rest of the game. And I think that's an issue that permeates throughout the entire DLC. Without any warning to the player, this DLC has a completely different mentality towards platforming, automation, and even difficulty settings. It completely reinvents the progression structure and level design philosophy of Sonic Frontiers, but does a really poor job of communicating that to first-time players, and it doesn't do a good job of presenting the different options players have to actually work with that. For example, Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon presents a drastic spike in difficulty from the base game, doing away with the automation that holds the player's hand throughout the base game and requiring mastery of Sonic's traversal system, something the player has never had to actually really rely on in the base game. However, you do have the option of flipping over to normal or easy difficulty, which restores some of that automation, providing the player the same safety net they've had throughout the rest of the game. Now, personally, I'm all in favor of the final stretch of a game being the most difficult part, but this was a drastic ramp up in difficulty. There wasn't a great deal of difference between easy, normal, and hard in the base game, but for the DLC, it's night and day, and this is not communicated in the slightest. I'd imagine a lot of people will have given up on the Final Horizon DLC without even knowing that flipping it to easy mode adds a whole slew of automation elements. It's not an amazing alternative because it's either the game basically plays itself or requires you to have mastered Sonic's traversal system. So immediately, Final Horizon, yeah, it is a very abrupt change from that main baseline game. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What Final Horizon set out to do was completely redo the final island of Sonic Frontiers. Ouranos Island was previously the grindiest island of the bunch, revolving entirely around a stingy collection quota, some shooter mini-games, and emerald hunting, which was far more basic and slow-paced than what previous islands had to offer. Top it off with an anticlimactic final battle, and you've got a chapter that screams, "We ran out of budget." A whimper of an ending to an otherwise incredibly enjoyable, if very unpolished game. Final Horizon overhauls this drastically. Ouranos Island is now home to 5 challenge towers akin to that of Raya Island, but this time they're significantly more challenging. Emerald hunting is now left to Amy, Knuckles, and Tails. However, this isn't done through unlocking keys this time. The Chaos Emeralds are now hidden by the Ancients, and it's up to the apparitions of Amy, Knuckles, and Tails to hunt them down through taking on different platforming challenges that will lead them to different objectives. Amy's objectives being to communicate with the Elders, Knuckles to destroy impact forms, and Tails to hack into Coco devices. When they work together, the Emeralds reveal themselves, which they can then hand over to Sonic for a brand new final battle. Immediately, we addressed the main issue with Ouranos Island, that being that it was purely just a long grind for tokens before. It's a much fresher experience this time, with a structure that continually keeps things fresh and exciting. But let's take a closer look at the actual details of the gameplay here, as each of the 3 new characters comes with their very own playstyle, and you are thrown into some pretty challenging platforming with them. Fortunately, Frontiers' open zone does allow you quite a bit of time to kind of get used to them, but at the same time, you will spend quite a bit of time grinding for experience points to unlock parts of the skill tree, which this time are not home to combos so much as just very basic abilities like stomping. Amy's gameplay is easily the best of the new gameplay styles, and definitely feels the most focused on what it wants to be. Like Sonic's gameplay, but with more of a focus on vertical movement. Amy jumps incredibly high as is, but is equipped with a powerful triple jump, which you can buff even further with the card stomp, which feels like an evolution of her hammer jump. Then she's got a really nice responsive glide move. The focus on Amy's tarot cards was controversial, with some folks feeling that they felt forced and that her iconic Pico Pico hammer was underrepresented this time. I personally take no issue with them doing something with her love of tarot cards. When it came to Amy's fortune-telling hobbies, you really previously had to just take the manual's word for it. It was nice that they actually introduced it into gameplay here, however I definitely agree with the sentiment that the hammer is underrepresented, being used purely as a parry. Why would the Hedgehog girl who has a giant mallet fight by throwing cards at enemies? That just doesn't make any sense. But it is the jumping mechanics that make Amy addictive to play in this game. She can effortlessly take on platforming sections designed for Knuckles' climbing abilities and Tails' flight because of how powerful her jump is. Of course, it won't yield any reward, but it's just fun to do, which taps into what Sonic is all about, the joys of basic traversal. Now, when I first played Final Horizon, I generally considered Knuckles not only to be the worst character in the game, but also the worst playable version of Knuckles in a mainline title. This is where most of the work in the patch was done. Previously, when going into a glide, it would stop his forward momentum dead so he could do a wind-up animation, and then turning while gliding felt clumsy and unresponsive. Now that being said, there were aspects to Knuckles that I did like about the initial release. Giving him a homing attack, allowing him to home in on enemies before engaging them in combat, was a great move. This also applies to Amy as well. A problem with melee combat in previous Sonic games has been that characters are vulnerable when not in their ball form, which means that approaching enemies while attacking could feel a bit risky. Here I can approach the enemy while in ball form and approach them quickly too. This was a very good move. That was where my positive for Knuckles really kinda ended though. Post-patch, Knuckles' gliding was massively improved. The wind-up animation was drastically reduced. There's still a teeny tiny delay, which isn't as nice as a seamless glide in the adventure titles, but it does at least turn nicely now too. Another improvement in the patch was combat. So in Final Horizon, when it came to these other characters, combat was a total afterthought, and while that's not too egregious for Amy and Tails, it certainly is for Knuckles. I want him to feel strong. Like the other characters, he really only has a couple of attack moves, unlike Sonic who can unlock various combos, and I'm willing to chalk that up to the digitized forms being weaker, which is acknowledged in the side story dialogue, but Knuckles feeling outright puny was just wrong. Fortunately, all the characters' attacks have been buffed. A little too much, actually. While Tower, Spider Plus, and Ninja Dudes still provide some challenge, any of these characters can absolutely raw dog these enemies. Poor Caterpillar Plus doesn't stand a chance anymore. But I definitely consider this an improvement, as I'd rather these characters feel overpowered than underpowered. But I think there was definitely a balance to be struck, and we really did just go from one extreme to another. I also think it would have been good to have made some of these boss fights compulsory, and you'll know why in a bit. So Knuckles is fixed, right? Hell no. The gliding and combat are definitely much better, but the climbing remains abysmal. This was always a bigger issue to me than gliding. Knuckles will no longer simply attach to a wall by gliding into it. You have to push forward now as well. But he's super twitchy and sensitive when on a wall, so you can't really attach to a wall without him climbing a couple of feet or so, giving you no time to kind of establish your footing while on the wall. His ability to climb fast differentiates him from Sonic nicely enough, but there's another problem. In the main game, walls you'd run up as Sonic tended to be pretty basic straight shots. For Knuckles, they're a bit more elaborate, which draws attention to a major issue with Sonic Frontiers' climbing tech. It's incredibly twitchy, sensitive, and clumsy. Knuckles can only climb certain walls, which is disappointing, but I guess when you're building atop a foundation that wasn't really designed with his character in mind, it is to be expected. But if he so much as comes into contact with anything that isn't a climbable wall while climbing, he'll detach. If you need to realign yourself by jumping, he'll push way too far off the wall, and the controls invert with the camera, so God forbid you decide to look in a different direction while you're climbing. This mechanic is an absolute mess and pales in comparison to how it was handled in the Sonic Adventure games. Tails is kind of the odd one out when it comes to combat. He doesn't have the homing attack or any options for melee combat. Instead, he has magic wrenches that he can throw at enemies, so he's all about ranged combat, and he can also do this while flying, which I think is kind of neat. I did notice an exploit where Tails can gain infinite height by charging his wrench attacks and flying into them. Welcome back, Rise of Lyric. Knuckles' infinite jump exploit was fortunately patched out. Tails' flight still has a wind-up animation, which isn't as egregious as Knuckles was, as you don't lose all of your forward momentum, but you do have to wait a little before increasing height, which I think we could easily do without, and mod codes for the PC version absolutely prove that. But I do really love how you can carry all of your momentum into flight, making some really nice flight arcs. Tails' flight controls feel really good. While Tails and especially Knuckles could use a bit more time in the oven, I'd say we at least have a decent selection of playstyles here, with Knuckles no longer being awful so much as he is just very, very flawed. Then there's their max ring moves though, and here's where things get a bit messy. With the entire skill tree unlocked, Amy, Knuckles, and Tails are granted a power-up while they have maximum rings, replacing Sonic's power boost. Amy gets a card bike which completely changes the character's physical properties, including weight and speed, making precision platforming incredibly difficult. Again with the wind-up animations. Now we're gonna have wind-up animations for basic ground traversal? Knuckles gets a faster glide that doesn't lose altitude, making connecting to walls even more obnoxious, as well as an offensive boost that turns him into a spinning top, made redundant by the spin dash. Knuckles' drill boost is the least annoying of the power boosts, I'm just not too fond of the animation. Tails gets his Tornado Cyclone, but it's incredibly fast, unwieldy, can soar through the air infinitely with infinite boost, rendering platforming challenges completely redundant. And it can fire a laser, but only while grounded, which it's very difficult to remain while in this mode. There is also no up and down aim on the laser either, moving only about 40 degrees either side. And of course, Tails' Cyclone has a fucking wind-up animation. Because why wouldn't it? All of these replace the typical boost the characters have if you have max rings, so you either have to just take it slow without boosting at all, or use these unwieldy power moves with no toggle to switch this off. Meaning I almost never wanted maximum rings. The characters do all at least have the spin dash, but again, that also does adjust your physical properties, so it's no replacement for the boost. I really wish we could switch these off. Sure, I can just lose some rings, but OCD. As for the platforming challenges, I really do like the focus on precision platforming on display here, especially for Amy. But these platforming challenges are so far beyond the game's already pathetic draw distance that they simply haven't loaded in yet, and so much of this DLC revolves around charting courses for platforms that haven't popped in. This becomes especially egregious for the final Chaos Emerald with Tails, as you have no idea which of these pathways actually leads to that emerald. This can be quite easily mitigated with the Cyclone, but I shouldn't have to exploit a broken mechanic just because the game has completely failed with basic conveyance. And no, the patch did nothing to fix this. The base game always had a pop-in issue. I can excuse a few objects popping in here and there, but with Frontiers, it's literally every second of gameplay. Whether it's some trees pixelating, shadows, lighting, the abundance of hideous non-diegetic platforming elements, enemies, literally everywhere you look, something is loading in with no smoothing or fading. For the base game, this fortunately didn't impact the gameplay experience beyond just basic immersion. For Final Horizon, it actively gets in the way. Where the fuck am I going? Sonic's side of the story is all about climbing the towers of the Ancient Masters to have them grant him a means of taking his cyber corruption and transforming it into a new form for him to use in the final battle against the End. But first you have to unlock the towers by grinding for Lookout Coco. These are gained by doing challenges in the brand new Cyberspace stages, and like the rest of this DLC, they took an incredibly experimental approach this time, for better and for worse. None of these are just straightforward Sonic platforming stages like the Cyberspace stages in the base game, as you'll be wrangling with different boost power-ups, gravity mechanics, time limits, and races against the dark apparition of Tails, who was referenced on Chaos Island but never shown in the base game, which I think is kinda cool to see. It's also got a very Sonic Adventure vibe with you racing Tails. The challenges within these Cyberspace stages vary from finding moon medals to rescuing flickies to finding a secret goal and more, meaning you never know quite what you're in for. It's like a big old toy box. But while I love how experimental these got, like the rest of Final Horizon, this did draw attention to some of the shortcomings of Sonic Frontiers' player framework. In the city stage with the tiny blocks, if your ground deacceleration in the sliders is anything below 100, you're gonna have a bad time. There's a Green Hill Tails race with falling platforms, and if you air dash, then homing attack, your air dash doesn't reset, meaning that if you aren't close enough to an enemy, well, you would just fall to your death, which is incredibly frustrating. There's a chemical plant stage where it's just, where the fuck am I actually going? In the base game, none of the cyberspace stages really accounted for the spin dash, but some worked better than others. In Final Horizon, some of these do account for the spin dash, and others don't. So it's kind of a gamble as to whether or not the spin dash is going to send you soaring over the stage, breaking record time, or send you to your death. With great power comes great responsibility, I guess, but I can't help but feel that a lot of these levels just feel like massive asset dumps, which is ultimately what they are, and I will say the upside is it is very cool to have a selection of Sonic levels which you're encouraged to just break open, but it absolutely does feel amateur. And the pop-in in these stages is once again incredibly egregious. While pop-in wasn't really an issue in the base game Cyberspace stages, I just think they did a better job at hiding it. Cyberspace is optional though, as you'll typically stumble upon enough lookout cocoa by complete accident. So then there are the towers themselves. And these can be pretty grueling. This is the kind of sweaty palms gameplay I'd ideally like to see from Sonic, so fair play to them. And all of the platforming in this entire DLC is 3D this time, which I really appreciate and hope future games will take on board. Apparently, Shadow Generations won't, but I hope games after that will. No side-scrolling to be found in Final Horizon. Finally! In the base game, Tower 2 had an issue with destructible homing attack objects not respawning, meaning if you fell to the bottom, you'd have a super hard time getting back up again. Fortunately, this has been fixed, but I still think these towers, while I do appreciate the difficulty, are too punishing. There's no form of checkpoint system to be found here, meaning that if you're falling to the bottom and you can't save yourself with an air dash, you are going to have to do this grueling challenge all over again. I think Raya Island had the right idea with the pulley switches that could pull you back up to where you were, and I have no idea why that wasn't implemented here. The final tower, though, is by far my favorite. It feels the fairest in terms of difficulty, the platforms are large and plentiful, and it's just the kind of 3D platforming challenge I've been hoping for from Sonic, minus it looking like a gross asset dump. Atop the towers are combat challenges, which vary wildly, with the second one being the hardest, but I don't quite understand why it is the way it is. So you've got 4 of these onion dudes to fight in a time limit, but the strategy to fight them never really changes, so why not just have one with a shorter time limit? The rest are all piss easy, with the exception of the final challenge, the infamous Master King Trial. For this challenge, your overly generous 15-second parry is traded out for a 4-frame perfect parry that you are given absolutely zero training with beforehand, and a non-regeneratable 400 ring limit, and you are tasked with fighting all 3 of the Titans all over again. Previously, when on hard mode, this challenge was just ridiculous. These bosses were not designed for a 4-frame perfect parry, and lack the necessary telegraphing animations to make that actually work. Since the patch, the perfect parry was made ever so slightly more accommodating by being switched to just 1 second rather than 4 frames. The patch also allowed easy mode players the full 15-second parry with a 600 ring limit, making this less of a roadblock. So, how does the Master King Trial fare up now? Well, Giganto and Knight are definitely doable. The perfect parry is far from ideal for these bosses considering their wind-up animations and lack of last-minute telegraph, but sadly, Wyvern really casts an unflattering light on proceedings. I'm sorry guys, I love this fight, but this gameplay mode proves that it's a pretty sloppily designed battle that was only really fun because base Frontiers allowed you such an excessive parry window that required no timing at all. Once timing is a part of the equation, you realize how difficult it is to actually see the missiles with so much happening on screen, and there's zero tell as to one of the Wyvern's attacks will actually finish their excessive wind-up animation, and even then it varies. This fight was clearly built around Frontier's excessive wiggle room, because once it requires any timing, the fight really does fall apart. Giganto and Knight still hold up nicely though. Another problem with this mode is that these rematches include the build-up to the fight. Climbing Giganto and Knight are kind of annoying, given that they can still hurt you in the run-up, losing you precious rings, but Wyvern has that entire 3-minute auto-running section that you have to do again and again and again every time you die. The reduced parry time requires some trial and error, but the punishment for error is doing everything all over again, including this fucking auto-running section, which requires almost zero skill and just becomes utterly mind-numbing and miserable. Now, while that's not fixed on easy or normal mode, I will say that I do appreciate easy mode effectively rendering this a replay of the Titans in the base game, But I think normal mode casts the most flattering light on these boss fights. With normal mode, the parry is 1.5 seconds, which is workable with all 3 boss fights, while still requiring some skill and timing. Even Wyvern works here. So, with the final challenge out of the way, we move on to the final battle, starting off with the Supreme Titan. Now, the Supreme Titan was easily the weakest of the Titan fights in Sonic Frontiers. A giganto copy-paste with less attacks, less HP, and weirdly punished you for parrying his attacks if you didn't think to take out one of his drones first. It was just a weird fight. I like that he flew around in the air, I guess. Final Horizon changes absolutely nothing about this fight at all. Not even fixing the missing wing animations during the second phase. What the fuck is that all about? And since the patch, it still hasn't changed in the slightest. I think they kind of treated this as a fake out while priming players for a more exciting next phase, and they may have also left him as easy as he was so that players could quickly return to the real final boss if they died during the fight, but at that point, like, what do you have against checkpoints? Or just make it a separate fight? Or because the fight is shit, you might as well just ditch it entirely. But then there is the final boss. I've gone on record saying that Final Horizon is home to my favorite final boss fight in Sonic history, and truth be told, that hasn't changed. But there are some pretty glaring issues with it that I will talk about. But this fight does combine the violent power fantasy of the previous Titan fights, doubles down on the spectacle, and requires a little strategy and use of Sonic's abilities that you don't often see in supersonic fights. So I love it for that. I also love how his attacks can eat your rings 10 at a time. But once again, a lack of conveyance is the major issue here. For starters, this fight requires that you be hit by a few of his attacks before you can transform into Supersonic 2, which is just... what? If you try to dodge these, you're just going to be wasting your time. Supreme has a power cable attached to his head from the end that continually regenerates his health, so attacking him head-on is kind of pointless. It becomes kind of obvious that you need to get that power cable off of him. But how? So I mentioned how this DLC needed more mandatory combat. You see, when fighting the ninja guys, they sometimes put their defenses up, but you're taught at the very beginning of Ouranos Island to hit the dodge button and swing around to the other side where he's vulnerable. The same is true of this fight. You tap the dodge button, Sonic will swing around to the power cable on the back of his head. But with the last of these enemy types being fought ages ago, you wouldn't necessarily think to even try that. You can use this same move again on Knight, but again, you wouldn't necessarily think to use this on such a large enemy. And Knight at least shields himself, so what could they have done to mitigate this? Well, when hitting a ninja while the defenses are up, you'll typically see this little red laser display show up in front of him, as well as a little sound that suggests that your attacks are doing nothing. It gives you a piece of player feedback telling you it's time to change tactics. I think if they literally just applied this to Supreme's head, it would be 100 times clearer what you actually had to fucking do. If you play the game on easy mode post-patch, however, you get a button prompt here. It also does the same in the Knight fight, making it immediately obvious what you actually have to do. But if you're committed to playing on hard mode and just can't figure this out, well, a walkthrough is your reward for 100%ing the entire island. This is a fucking fever dream. I will say I like that it doesn't spell it out for you to side-loop the gun and jetpack though. I think that one's clear enough and had me going, oh, once I'd figured it out. Also, actually working Supreme's gun into the fight. This marks the first time that side-looping is actually mandatory in a supersonic boss fight. The second phase of this fight gets a little weird too though. Supreme now protects the cable on his head, so you have to, once again, swing around to the back of him where his arms are just swinging about and then you hit parry. But it's not made that clear that this is what you actually have to do, as it doesn't really look like he's even attacking you, so much as just waving his arms about. If we could maybe see Sonic being batted about a bit here and there, I would maybe think to parry. But otherwise it's just like, now what? Don't worry, it gives you a ridiculous amount of time to figure that out. Once again, not really feeling like I'm being attacked here. If you manage to fail this, he'll attack your friends who all have their own health bars. I do like this idea, it really does give extra stakes, it's just again, it's very unintuitive. And in the second phase of the end fight, if you get hit by any of his attacks, he performs an unavoidable move that will reduce your rings to 100. Now this is cool, but if you have less than 100 rings, you're out of the battle. And just to insult you, if you die twice, the game automatically switches you to easy mode. So if you're under 100 rings, all of his attacks are effectively one-shots, and the game doesn't communicate that at all. This is a pretty easy fight when you actually know what to do. The real challenge comes in figuring out what the fuck the game actually wants you to do, and the game makes such a point of withholding that information. Also, the camera angle is just, what the fuck is happening here? Wait, hang on. We were just in the arena a second ago, and now he's running from the sea to the arena? You could have just had him run from the arena to the outside area. Man, they're lucky this is so awesome because this is so fucking amateur. Oh, I'm nitpicking, am I? Well, if you have such a problem with nitpicking, this must be what your hair looks like. But for its flaws, this is still an incredibly thrilling fight. I love how this battle incorporates the psi loop, how you need to find an optimal order of which to do things, be it tearing the cable off of his head or getting some extra hits in beforehand. And the successful quick psi loop moves are awesome, with Sonic snapping his fingers crushing the Supreme Titan. And if you parry all of the Supreme's attacks, he'll eventually change tactics and just charge at you like the girl from The Ring. Having Robotnik also utilizing the Supreme's gun, the spectacle is just off the charts, firing off on all cylinders, and ultimately gives the game a climactic finale that it so sorely needed. Even if I do wish we could have actually interacted with the Big Purple Moon. I think my dream version of this is where the final open zone is the Big Purple Moon, and you just have to be as destructive as possible to destroy it before battling Supreme in space as a last-ditch effort. That would have been cool, but definitely would have required more of a manpower and budget. Also, we get to see Sonic's cyberform fully unleashed, but we don't ever get to actually play as it. Not even for a QTE, which is a little disappointing. But with that, the day is won, Sonic fucks hard, everyone goes home, and Sage lives. Alright, so let's talk quickly about the story here. Sonic's grand team-up with Robotnik in the base game amounted to Robotnik giving him a single Chaos Emerald. Sonic's cyber corruption was also waved away instantly. Well, those issues are addressed. Everyone takes part in the finale this time, and the cyber corruption is converted to power. It's a little clunky now, though, with Sonic losing the cyber corruption and his friends only to jump through a hoop and get them both back and then go for a brand new plan. Makes Rhea Island's ending cutscene feel like a blip. What was even achieved here? Okay, Robotnik is out of cyberspace in your team up, but that is a lot of pomp for just that. But I am glad that the other characters get something to do here, and to see Tails' arc of finding his confidence actually come into play this time, rather than just setting the stage for future stories that may or may not happen. I also like that this time the end is a looming threat, released from cyberspace and on its way to Earth. Although, okay, I'm a bit unclear. In the base game, the end was sealed within the Supreme Titan and then exited the Supreme to go to space. Yet here it's already out, so what's the Supreme fight for? Is that just one of the trials now? Why is it easier than all of the others? Why are we even fighting this thing when it could potentially help us to fight against the end? You know, the thing it did in the base game. I also think this whole thing could have been communicated better if we could actually see the end in the sky, having it loom over us like it does in the finale, getting closer and closer. This would have given Ouranos a much more unique atmosphere as well. Again, conveyance is the word of the day, as we're told through flavor text that there was an earthquake and everything, including the Coco, are being corrupted. Okay, but where though? Also, if Robotnik is on our side, why are his creations still trying to kill me? But then again, they are in the Ancients' colors. Did the Ancients create these too? Okay, so the End wiped these guys out and the End is the villain. How again? So okay, I'm gonna start wrapping things up here. Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon is like Sonic Frontiers in its most undiluted form. All of this game's strengths are ramped up to 100, with it providing some of the most exciting stuff in the entire package. But it also draws a lot more attention to the game's flaws, which were already glaring and are now lit up like Vegas. It's a very flawed package. Rather than being a high-quality capstone to Sonic Frontiers, they've taken Sonic Frontiers, a game made of toothpicks and sellotape, made Final Horizon, a DLC made of some leftover toothpicks and sellotape, and then sellotape that to the base game. The outcome is a much more exciting final chapter with a lot more variety and engaging challenges that really test the player. But it's also a very steep difficulty spike that too often leans on just withholding information from the player for the sake of just being difficult, but not necessarily more challenging, if that makes sense. But it's hugely experimental, and I think it all starts to make sense why a 6-hour extension was completely free. Like the rest of Sonic Frontiers, this was really just a very large tech demo to gauge feedback. With Update 2, they gave us more options to tweak controls based on our feedback, and with Update 3, they changed the ending based on our feedback and laid down the groundwork for the return of multiple playable characters. It's an all-out stress test of half-baked ideas and mechanics for us to try out, none of which perfected yet. This game is effectively a preventative measure for games like Sonic Lost World and Sonic Forces, where where the game is perfectly polished and presentable, but doesn't really deliver on anything anyone actually wants. This here is them taking a step into bold new frontiers. How's this? Is this what you want for future games? With minimal investment and budget. This game and its DLC were effectively made so they don't have to keep making baby steps for future games. Frontiers is not a step in the right direction, it's a prototype. A prototype that they sold us for $60, and I wouldn't blame anyone for feeling a bit resentful of that. But it also happened to be one of the most enjoyable and exciting game experiences I've ever played, in spite of its lack of polish. And I think we're seeing the fruits of this experiment in Shadow Generations, a game that is clearly utilizing a lot of the groundwork of Sonic Frontiers, from its controls to its combat to its open zone-inspired hub world, and now with a sense of polish to it. Now it's fully cooked through. From the looks of things anyway. We've still got a little under a month until we truly get our hands on it. But if there's one aspect of Sonic Frontiers that wasn't undercooked, it's that soundtrack. Many different genres come together in an incredible body of work, and Final Horizon is home to the absolute best of it, with the best open zone themes in the game, especially Second Wind. The new character themes for Amy, Knuckles, and Tails work well for this more somber game and fit their arcs, although they can get a bit repetitive in the context of open zone gameplay, which leads me to ask why the jukebox was never patched into Final Horizon. And I'm Here Revisited may just be the best Sonic vocal track ever made. Hearing it live at the Sonic Symphony had me thinking I'd died and gone to paradise. Otani's soundtrack for this game does a lot of heavy lifting, and that needs to be acknowledged. I think without this, the game would be a total atmospheric dud. But that is Sonic Frontiers Final Horizon. It's the best of Sonic Frontiers, it's the worst of Sonic Frontiers. And the music is some of the best you'll ever hear. It's janky but thrilling, unintuitive but entertaining, and it's the reason I can never do number scores. Because here's the thing, if I gave this game a number score based on the quality, I could not give this any higher than a 5. It is sloppy toppy with a side of booty cheeks. But I feel like that would misrepresent how compelling and unironically fun the game really is, and that's what a game is all about. So if I were to rate it based on how much fun I had, it could be no lower than an 8, which I think just draws attention to why number scores don't work. The game is fun, and not in a way that's like, oh, look how fun it is to break this game open. Fun in a way that is actually intended. Well, for the most part anyway. I've gotten the most enjoyment out of Sonic Frontiers that I have any Sonic game, and sure, you could ask, what does that say about Sonic? But I adore this franchise. I love Sonic. It's my favorite gaming franchise of all time. Sonic Frontiers can just be described as, well, everything. It's literally the entire spectrum, the good and the bad of it. It all amounts to a bigger picture that will either be some of the most fun you've ever had with a video game, or a shameful embarrassment. To me, at its best, it's a total thrill ride that gives me freedom to just enjoy being Sonic. It fundamentally evokes joy in its movement system. At worst, it's a cry for help, a bigger budget, more manpower. And from the looks of things, it did its job and will go down in history as Sonic Team's appallingly crafted masterpiece that set the roadmap for the future of Sonic while drunkenly tripping over its own feet. And I love this piss-soaked little rat of a game and its wayward DLC son. But seriously, if Frontiers 2 is not a huge step up in quality, I will blow up a village. Discuss, and as always, if you've enjoyed this video and you want to support more like it, be sure to hit subscribe, hit the like button, and in the description below is the link to my Patreon page, where for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name in the credits of these videos, with a special shout out going to the patrons in the $5 and above tier. We have Cho Henshin, KB, RT0, Calx, Hypes, Sad Goku, Dare Denny, SSS06, KO Bennett, Ken K, Mr. SP, Cyrus the Skeptic, Biotin. Oh no, I've used up all of the helium, what am I meant to do now? And Vera Wild. Thank you folks so much for your generosity, and to all of you at home, thank you so much for watching, and have a great day. Now get out of here.